For a long time, the factors contributing to the technical superiority of European ships remained hidden in archives. In 1571, the Ottoman Empire completely controlled the eastern Mediterranean. In the mid-16th century, the port docks of Venice operated almost around the clock. Craftsmen were creating a completely new type of ship for naval warfare. These developments were kept strictly secret from foreign informants. Watch the video to the end to find out how the appearance of just 6 heavy ships completely changed the balance of power on the water. Don Juan of Austria took command of the combined forces. This commander gathered ships from several European states under his banner. The armada included fleets from Spain, Venice, and the Papal States. The combined fleet required enormous resources for full material support. Each country provided its best ships of the line and experienced navigators. Preparations for the large-scale campaign took several months of continuous work in the ports. Barrels of fresh water, provisions, and gunpowder were continuously loaded into the holds. The commanders personally checked the condition of the sails and rigging before setting out to sea. Particular attention was paid to the coordination of crews from different countries. Navigators carefully studied maps of the currents in the eastern Mediterranean. The success of the entire multi-day expedition depended entirely on the coordination of maneuvers. Signalmen practiced transmitting commands daily using a system of flags on the masts. The city arsenals issued high-quality equipment for the boarding teams. Blacksmiths forged spare metal parts for cannon mounts and heavy anchors. Carpenters prepared smooth oak planks for quick repair of possible holes. The entire combined fleet was a huge floating supply mechanism. The Armada began its journey in the early autumn of 1571. The ships lined up in long columns and left their safe harbors. A favorable wind filled the heavy sails of the galleys and cargo ships. The fleet moved slowly along the coastline, navigating by rocky capes. The command regularly held tactical meetings on the flagship. The captains discussed the geometry of combat in open sea conditions. Scouts in light vessels went far ahead to search for enemy squadrons. They returned with accurate data on the movements of enemy ships. Discipline on all decks was maintained by strict rules of daily routine. Sailors stood watch at the compasses and regularly cleaned the wooden deck. Gunners cleaned the barrels of their guns and checked the moisture level of the gunpowder in the barrels. Each crew member knew exactly where to be according to the battle schedule. Gradually, the Allied flotilla approached the waters of the Ionian Sea. The tension among the crews grew with every nautical mile they traveled. Signal oil lamps at night helped the ships keep their distance. Ahead lay the bay where the enemy's main naval forces were based. The Venetian galleasses sailed in a separate group due to their enormous weight. They were towed by ordinary galleys to maintain the overall speed of the entire squadron. The Ottoman naval forces were commanded by the experienced Admiral Ali Pasha. His huge armada consisted mainly of standard light galleys. These long ships were renowned for their ability to move quickly under oars in calm conditions. The Ottoman tactic was based on a rapid frontal approach to the enemy. The galleys were arranged in a wide line in the shape of a huge crescent. Their main task was to quickly close in on the enemy ships. After closing in, the outcome of the battle was decided by the numerical superiority of the boarding crews. The artillery on Ottoman galleys was located exclusively in the bow of the ship. Usually, it consisted of one large cannon and several smaller guns on either side of it. This arrangement allowed them to fire only strictly straight ahead. The guns were used only once, immediately before the collision of the hulls. Ali Pasha relied on the excellent training of his archers and infantrymen. They took up positions on the high superstructures of the stern and bow of the ship. On command, they showered the enemy deck with a hail of arrows and metal darts. This forced the enemy crew to seek cover and weakened their defenses before the landing. The fleet was based in the convenient harbor of Lepanto in the protected Gulf of Patras. This position allowed them to control the narrow passage into the Gulf of Corinth. The ships were anchored, replenishing their water supplies from coastal sources. The command was confident of its absolute superiority in this area. Ali Pasha's intelligence reported the approach of the combined Christian fleet. The Ottomans knew the numerical strength of their enemy, but underestimated its firepower. They expected to encounter the traditional formation of standard single-deck galleys. The appearance of fundamentally new ships at sea came as a complete surprise to them. The commanders of the Ottoman squadrons received orders to take their ships out of the harbor into open water. They lined up their ships in a long, continuous line from shore to shore. The distance between the sides of the galleys was minimal to prevent a breakthrough through the formation. The oars rose and fell rhythmically, creating powerful thrust on the calm water. Ali Pasha himself occupied the center of the Ottoman formation on the flagship galley. The right flank was commanded by the experienced navigator Mehmet Sirako, who knew the local waters well. The left flank was led by Uluj Ali, who commanded the fastest ships. The fleet was a single, well-coordinated mechanism, ready for an offensive thrust. The ships slowly advanced toward the enemy to the sound of drums. Long silk pennants with calligraphic inscriptions fluttered on the masts. The crews took their places, preparing ladders and hooks for the upcoming assault. The distance between the two huge armadas was steadily decreasing. The secret weapon of the Holy League was 6 huge Venetian galleasses. They were a transitional link between a rowing galley and a sailing galleon. These ships were several times larger, wider, and heavier than the standard ships of the time. The basis of the design was a massive wooden hull with high sides. Above the row of oars was a solid deck that protected the rowers from enemy shells. This protection allowed the crew to remain operational even under heavy fire. The superstructures at the bow and stern resembled real wooden fortresses. The main advantage of the galleass was its incredible firepower. Engineers placed heavy bronze cannons along the sides of the ship. This radically distinguished the galleass from the usual galley, which could only fire forward. Now, the ship could fire at the enemy from any side. Artillery ports were cut directly into the thick oak sides of the ship. Each galleass was equipped with up to 30 heavy and medium cannons. In addition, dozens of light swivel guns were mounted on the upper decks. The total weight of a single galleass's broadside exceeded the firepower of an entire squadron of galleys. Due to their enormous weight, galleasses had extremely low speeds. Hundreds of physically strong men rowing were required to move them. 3 tall masts carried square sails, which only helped the ship when the wind was favorable. In calm conditions, galleasses moved extremely slowly and were difficult to maneuver. The high sides made the galleass virtually impregnable to classic boarding. The enemy's light galleys were physically unable to throw hooks at such a height. The galleass crew looked down on the enemy decks from above. This gave them a tremendous tactical advantage in defending against boarding. The Venetian command decided to use these ships as floating forts. It was decided to move them far ahead of the main line of their fleet. 6 galleasses lined up at a distance of about a mile from each other. They were to take the first blow of the advancing enemy armada. Each ship carried a reinforced detachment of Marines on board. The soldiers were positioned behind sturdy wooden bulwarks equipped with embrasures for muskets. The heavy guns were loaded with cast-iron cannonballs, while the smaller ones were loaded with lead grape shot. The commanders of the galleasses strictly forbade opening fire until the enemy was within optimal range. The galleasses looked like unwieldy giants against the backdrop of swift, light ships. Outwardly, they gave the impression of clumsy transport barges with high sides. Until the very last moment, the enemy had no idea how many cannons were hidden behind the closed ports. Two huge fleets met in the waters of the Gulf of Patras near the coast of Greece. Hundreds of ships from both sides lined up on the water. It was a grand spectacle, consisting of thousands of masts, sails, and flags. This clash would determine the fate of the entire Mediterranean for decades to come. There was incredible tension in the air before the inevitable battle between two powerful empires. At stake was complete control of the most important sea trade routes of the time. Tens of thousands of sailors and soldiers were prepared to give their lives for the long-awaited victory. The water around them seemed completely calm before the impending storm of human anger. Commander-in-Chief of the combined forces, Don Juan of Austria decided to divide his huge fleet into three main battle lines. The center of the armada consisted of the heaviest and most reliable Spanish and Venetian ships. The young and ambitious commander volunteered to personally command these ships. His task was to withstand the main enemy attack and prevent the enemy from breaking through the line of defense. The Holy League gathered the best sailors from all over Christian Europe under its banners. Far ahead of this gigantic formation stood 6 huge Venetian galleasses. They towered above the water like impregnable floating breakwaters made of thick oak. These ships were at a considerable and very risky distance from the main support forces. The commanders of the conventional galleys behind them kept a close eye on the distance to these forward forts. No one wanted to break formation before the appointed time. Suddenly, nature decided to make its own adjustments to the course of the upcoming large-scale naval battle. The weather changed dramatically just minutes before the first fire contact. The tailwind died down and soon began to blow directly towards the huge Ottoman armada. This gave the Christians an unexpected and very important tactical advantage on the water. Now, the thick smoke from the future cannon salvos would fly straight into the enemy's face. The Ottoman commander-in-chief, Ali Pasha, maintained the traditional eastern formation of the fleet. His ships were lined up in the shape of a very wide and threatening concave crescent. Hundreds of light and fast ships moved incredibly synchronously across the sea. They strictly maintained a perfect front line without a single visible gap. It was a deadly tactic of naval warfare that had been perfected over many years. The Ottomans' cunning plan was to quickly encircle the edges of the Christian fleet. They wanted to trap the enemy's unwieldy ships in a tight steel vise. The Turks could clearly see 6 unusually large ships directly ahead. However, due to the absence of the usual oars, they mistook them for ordinary, unwieldy cargo barges carrying provisions. This mistake proved fatal for the entire Turkish vanguard. The captains of the Ottoman galleys loudly ordered their crews to prepare the heavy bow cannons for immediate firing. They planned to fire a single powerful shot just before the ships collided. After that, a fierce and bloody boarding battle was to begin on the enemy decks. No one in the attacking Turkish fleet even considered changing their course. They had no intention of bypassing these 6 strange ships. In stark contrast to this noise, there was a frightening, absolute silence on the galleys. It was broken only by the creaking of thick ship's ropes and the lapping of waves against the dew wooden sides. The experienced Venetian artillerymen had long since lit their long fuses. They stood silently and tensely by their loaded guns, awaiting the main command. Military discipline on these frontline ships had been brought to perfection. The captains of the huge galleasses calmly and carefully assessed the shrinking distance. They kept their eyes fixed on the rapidly approaching dense formation of the enemy. The heavy wooden hatches of the gun ports on their high sides were still tightly closed. This reliably concealed the true firepower of the ships from the eyes of the Turkish commanders. The deadly trap was ready to snap shut on the attackers. When the Ottoman ships were only about half a mile away, a sharp signal sounded. Loud boatswain's pipes whistled simultaneously on the decks of all 6 galleasses. The heavy wooden hatches of the side ports swung up in unison along the entire length of the ships. The muzzles of heavy bronze cannons slowly and menacingly emerged from the dark square openings. At that very moment, the Ottoman commanders realized with chilling horror that they had made a critical mistake. The huge formation of Ottoman galleys continued to move forward very quickly by inertia. The light wooden ships simply had no physical ability to brake sharply on the water. Hundreds of warships were tightly packed together in a very dense formation side by side. A change of course by even one galley would inevitably lead to a massive collision with its neighbors. They were forced to continue their fatal movement straight toward the Venetian side batteries. The commanders of the forward forts waited a few more seconds for maximum proximity. They raised signal flags, giving the order to begin firing. In the next chapter, you will learn exactly how the artillery crews of these floating fortresses performed. The silence over the bay was broken by the roar of dozens of heavy bronze guns. 6 Venetian galleasses opened heavy artillery fire almost simultaneously. Tongues of flame and thick clouds of white gunpowder smoke burst from the side ports. Heavy cast-iron cannonballs flew toward the dense formation of approaching Ottoman ships. It was an artillery volley of unprecedented destructive power for that time. The roar of the shots echoed across the bay, deafening the sailors on the decks. The huge galleasses shook violently from the incredible recoil of dozens of heavy barrels. The seawater around them literally boiled from the falling wadding and wooden debris. The air was almost instantly filled with the acrid and suffocating smell of burnt black powder. A blow of incredible power was delivered directly from the flanks to the advancing enemy line. Due to the extreme density of the Ottoman galleys formation, it was practically impossible for the Venetian gunners to miss. Cast-iron cannonballs pierced the thin pine sides of the Mediterranean ships with astonishing ease. Unimaginable confusion and panic broke out on the decks of the leading Ottoman galleys. The clear, orderly ranks instantly descended into chaos, and the captains completely lost control. Heavy enemy shells broke the tall wooden masts of the attacking ships with a terrible crash. Huge structures collapsed directly onto the dense rows of rowers chained to their benches. Elegant wooden superstructures were shattered into hundreds of deadly, sharp splinters under the merciless blows of metal. Many Ottoman ships lost their speed and maneuverability almost instantly. Their long oars were brutally broken by cannonballs or jammed by debris falling from above. People desperately tried to escape the wooden hail flying from all sides. The water of the bay quickly turned dark from the huge number of wounded sailors. The proud and confident Turkish attack was completely stifled at its very beginning. It was during these terrible moments that the galleasses fully demonstrated their most important advantage. It was the phenomenal speed of artillery reloading in battle for that historical period. Unlike ordinary galleys, which had to turn around for a long time to fire again, these giants stood motionless. In addition to heavy destructive cannonballs, incredibly deadly lead grape shot was actively used. It was fired continuously from numerous smaller caliber guns, skillfully positioned on the upper decks. The grape shot covered the completely open decks of the attacking Ottoman galleys with a very wide and dense fan. This action instantly neutralized the best janissary boarding teams while they were still far from their targets. Archers and trained musketeers standing on the high superstructures of Turkish ships found themselves in a terrifying situation. They were left completely defenseless against this endless metal storm. The density of the return fire from the galleasses simply did not allow them to even raise their heads from behind their cover. No one on the Turkish ships could calmly take aim to return fire with their weapons. The decks of the attacking ships were rapidly emptying under the merciless hail of hot lead. The proud front line of the perfect Ottoman crescent began to crumble inexorably before their eyes. Heavily damaged galleys came to a sudden and uncontrolled halt on the rough sea. In doing so, they completely blocked the path of the warships sailing directly behind them. Horrific traffic jams quickly formed on the water, with dozens of hulls colliding with each other. Any meaningful navigation in the very center of the grand battle became absolutely impossible. The Turkish command on the left and right flanks completely lost important visual contact with their admiral. Ali Pasha could no longer transmit new orders using the usual signal flags. The surviving Ottoman captains desperately tried to return at least some pitiful fire. However, their light stone and iron cannonballs only bounced off the thick sides of the enemy ships with a dull thud. The low-firing artillery from the low-lying Ottoman galleys simply could not cause them any serious damage. Not a single Turkish galley was able to inflict any significant damage on these floating forts. They towered above the chaos of destruction like indestructible rocks in a raging Red Sea. Their numerous heavy cannons continued to calmly sow blind panic and mass death. The Turkish fleet's hopes for a quick victory melted away with every passing minute of this nightmare. Meanwhile, the tailwind played into the Christians' hands, carrying the acrid smoke directly onto their enemies. This very dense white cloud of gunpowder further disoriented the enemy helmsmen, depriving them of valuable visibility. The Ottoman ships were moving almost blindly, constantly bumping into each other in the gray haze. The captains now relied only on the cries of their drowning comrades and the terrible sounds of breaking wood. The unified, powerful line of attack finally broke up into disorderly groups of isolated ships. Meanwhile, the impregnable Venetian galleasses continued their deadly bombardment of the waters around them. Their heaviest lower guns accurately targeted the largest targets of the disoriented enemy. At the same time, light swivel guns harshly suppressed any rare attempts by the Turks to approach. All the water around these mighty floating fortresses was quickly covered with wooden debris and bodies. A total of 6 well-prepared ships were able to break the advance of a huge fleet of many thousands. This first stage of the battle lasted no more than an hour, but its results were decisive. The galleasses fulfilled their main tactical task by breaking the integrity of the enemy's formation. The Ottomans were forced to change their plans under heavy fire. The Christian fleet behind the galleasses was just beginning its advance. Faced with an insurmountable wall of fire, the Ottoman galleys attempted to bypass the galleasses. They began to change course sharply, evading the zone of destruction of the side batteries. This maneuver completely destroyed the original formation in the shape of a perfect crescent. The ships on the right and left flanks of the Ottoman fleet rushed towards the coast, trying to find a safe passage. In doing so, they inevitably moved away from Ali Pasha's central squadron. Huge, unprotected gaps formed in the united front line. It was physically impossible to bypass 6 heavy ships without losing tactical formation. Some of the Ottoman galleys still tried to slip between the galleasses. They hoped to quickly pass through the firing zone thanks to their high speed. However, the galleass engineers had anticipated this scenario. Artillerymen at the stern and bow of the forts opened crossfire on the passing ships. The galleys that found themselves between 2 galleasses came under double broadside fire. Their wooden hulls could not withstand such powerful mechanical impact. The ships lost buoyancy and slowly sank into the waters of the bay. The passage between the floating fortresses proved to be a deadly trap for light ships. Ali Pasha, being in the center, found himself cut off from his flank commanders. He could no longer coordinate the actions of his entire huge armada. His flagship galley was forced to make its way through the congestion of damaged ships. Control of the battle passed to the initiative of individual captains. The commanders of the Ottoman ships made decisions based on the local situation around them. Some tried to retreat, others went for a desperate ram with their galleasses. The wooden prows of the light galleys were smashed to pieces against the thick oak plating of the Venetian giants. The galleasses remained motionless, like rocks in a stormy sea. As a result of chaotic maneuvers, the Ottoman fleet lost its main advantage, the coordination of its attack. The ships scattered into disorderly groups, hindering each other's maneuvers. Oars became entangled, and masts caught on the rigging of neighboring galleys. The Armada's speed dropped to almost zero. At this time, the main forces of the Holy League continued to maintain a strict linear formation. The ships of Don Juan of Austria slowly and confidently approached the gaps that had formed. They sailed through the gunpowder smoke, guided by the flashes of the galleasses' shots. The Christian captains saw a disorganized and vulnerable enemy before them. The galleasses ceased firing at distant targets so as not to hit their own approaching ships. They concentrated on finishing off the damaged Ottoman ships in their immediate vicinity. The role of floating fortresses at this stage was completely fulfilled. The decisive moment had arrived when the full power of the two empires was to converge at a single point in space and time. The main forces of the two huge fleets finally drew close for a direct physical collision that could no longer be prevented. Don Juan of Austria's flagship galley, named Real, headed purposefully straight for Ali Pasha's huge ship, named Sultana. These were the largest, heaviest, and most incredibly ornate ships in all the armadas of the time. Their meeting on the water was not just a coincidence, but a deliberate act of will by the two commanders. Each of them understood that it was here, in the very heart of the battle, that the outcome of the entire confrontation would be decided. Spectators from neighboring ships watched with bated breath as the two wooden leviathans rushed toward each other, preparing for a deadly blow. The two flagships collided with such force that the heavy wooden structures creaked at every seam. The huge boarding bridge prepared in advance on the Spanish ship crashed directly onto the bow superstructure of the Sultana. The ships literally locked together, turning into a single floating platform rocking on the waves. Other galleys instantly began to gather around them, forming a dense and chaotic island of wood in the middle of the bay. The renowned Spanish heavy infantry began their famous methodical advance onto the deck of the Ottoman flagship. The soldiers moved in perfectly tight formation, professionally covering themselves with tall steel shields from enemy projectiles. Their entire tactic was based on gradually, inch by inch, capturing free space and systematically displacing the defenders. The Ottoman janissaries responded with fierce arquebus fire and released a hail of heavy arrows into the sky. The battle in the very center of the Gulf of Patras was a continuous and bloody series of boarding maneuvers. Ships were hooked together with iron hooks, and entire crews crossed over to neighboring decks, engaging in hand-to-hand combat. The powerful artillery fell completely silent at this point, as the risk of accidentally damaging their own ships was too great. The outcome of these localized and extremely brutal skirmishes was now decided solely by cold steel and iron discipline. Spanish musketeers fired very accurately and precisely from their positions on high masts and stern superstructures. They methodically took out enemy commanders, officers, and signalmen, depriving the enemy of coordination. The gradual deprivation of the enemy's leadership brought even greater chaos and panic to the ranks of the Ottoman defenders. The experienced infantry of the Holy League took complete control of more and more sections of the deck step by step. New reserve ships approached the interlocked flagships from all sides, landing fresh reinforcements. This huge artificial island constantly grew in size as new ships joined the interlocked hulls. Don Juan of Austria was personally in the thick of the action, controlling the transfer of forces to the main direction of attack. His main task at that moment was to maintain the initiative at the very center of this grandiose and terrible battle. The Ottoman defenders resisted with the true tenacity of the doomed, using their curved sabers and short spears. They repeatedly tried to push the Spaniards back onto their ships, regardless of the enormous losses. All the decks were littered with broken masts, torn sails, and heavy wet ropes. Moving through this improvised wooden maze required incredible and exhausting physical effort from the soldiers. Gradually, the obvious superiority of the Spanish infantry and their heavy defensive equipment began to have an impact on the battlefield. Sturdy steel cuirasses and helmets reliably protected European soldiers from blows from light Eastern-style cold weapons. They advanced slowly but surely toward the main mast of the Sultan, sweeping away everything in their path. Capturing and controlling the enemy flagship meant complete strategic victory in the entire central sector. Overall control of the Ottoman center was finally and irrevocably lost immediately after Ali Pasha himself was neutralized. The terrible news spread quickly to all the neighboring ships, causing mass confusion among the Turks. The capture of the main flagship banner by the Holy League completely demoralized the last remaining defenders. At that moment, the central squadron of the great Ottoman Empire effectively ceased to exist as a single combat unit. The remnants of the surviving Ottoman ships in the center began to retreat hastily and in panic, literally cutting the boarding ropes with axes. They desperately tried to get out of this dense and dangerous cluster of ships into clear, open water. The Spanish and Venetian galleys immediately organized a rapid pursuit of all the retreating enemy forces. The overall outcome of the great battle in the Gulf of Patras now shifted definitively to the left and right flanks. On the right flank of the Holy League forces, the situation at the same time was much less clear-cut and simple. For some reason, the Genoese admiral Giovanni Andrea Doria led his galleys far out into the open sea, performing a strange maneuver. He claimed that he was trying to prevent a possible flanking maneuver by the Ottoman ships under the command of the cunning Uluj Ali. However, this ambiguous decision led to the formation of a dangerous and very wide gap between the center and the right wing of the Christians. Uluj Ali, being an incredibly experienced Algerian corsair, brilliantly and instantly took advantage of this tactical mistake by the Genoese. He sharply turned his fastest and lightest galleys, directing them straight into the gap that had formed in the formation. His main and only goal now was the completely unprotected flank of the central Christian squadron. This bold maneuver clearly demonstrated to everyone the superiority of the light Ottoman ships in terms of speed and maneuverability. The Algerian ships furiously attacked the outer galleys belonging to the Order of St. John. The Maltese knights suddenly found themselves clearly outnumbered, completely surrounded by the superior forces of their cunning enemy. A difficult and bloody defense of the decks began, where every meter of wooden flooring was fought for with great difficulty. During this skirmish, Uluj Ali managed to capture several Christian ships and even took the flagship banner of the order. However, the Algerian commander was unable to build on his local success due to the prompt intervention of the Allies. Noticing a dangerous breakthrough on the flank, Don Juan of Austria immediately sent his strong reserve squadron to this sector. The heavy Spanish ships blocked the path of Uluj Ali's light galleys in time, threatening to crush them with their mass. Quickly realizing the real threat of complete encirclement, the Ottoman commander made a decision and gave the order for a hasty retreat. Taking advantage of their naturally high speed, the Algerian ships quickly headed for the open sea under the cover of the horizon. Surprisingly, they maintained their battle formation and were able to lead a significant part of the ships away completely undamaged. This was perhaps the only squadron of the entire Ottoman fleet that managed to avoid complete defeat that day. Uluj Ali managed to preserve the most experienced of his navigators for future military campaigns at sea. At the same time, equally tense and important positional clashes were taking place on the left flank. Venetian Admiral Barbarigo acted very competently and literally trapped Mehmed Sirocco's ships between his line and the shore. The Ottomans instantly lost all room for maneuver and could no longer use their speed advantage. Their light galleys kept running aground on the coastal shoals in desperate attempts to avoid the devastating fire. The methodical Venetians boarded all the enemy ships stuck in shallow water one by one. The crews of many Ottoman ships abandoned their decks in panic and tried to swim to the Greek shore. Christian infantrymen quickly established complete control over all the unattended galleys. Thus, the entire left wing of the Ottoman fleet was completely blocked and finally neutralized. Admiral Barbarigo personally commanded this complex operation, remaining on the open deck of his flagship under fire. His well-thought-out and very precise positioning of the ships left the enemy no chance of a successful breakthrough. The Venetian galleys maintained their tight formation, thwarting any attempts by the Ottomans to escape from this coastal trap. This part of the great battle eventually turned into a systematic and calm mopping up of the water area. Both of these flank clashes once again confirmed the enormous importance of discipline and strict maintenance of battle formation. The Genoese admiral's unfortunate mistake nearly led to a real catastrophe in the very center of the entire armada. At the same time, the competent and decisive actions of the Venetians on the left flank ensured complete domination for the Christians. The outcome of this long and exhausting naval confrontation was now finally decided. By the evening of that momentous day, October 7th, the sounds of cannon fire over the bay finally began to gradually subside. The entire expanse of water for many kilometers was littered with pieces of wood, torn sails, and overturned boats. Despite its losses, the Holy League fleet retained its full combat capability and established control over the battlefield. The Ottomans, meanwhile, lost the bulk of their grand armada in the waters of the Gulf of Patras forever. The success of the boarding operations was ensured by a special approach to the composition of the infantry units. The Spanish Marines were considered the best trained in Europe at the time. The soldiers underwent special training for action on an unstable, swaying wooden surface. They were able to maintain their balance and formation even in heavy seas. Their main protective gear was a heavy steel cuirass and a sturdy morion helmet. This armor reliably protected vital organs from arrows and light blows. The equipment made the infantrymen slow but incredibly stable in close combat. The Ottoman janissaries, deprived of heavy armor, lost in direct combat. The tactic of capturing the enemy deck was based on strict coordination of actions. The first row of infantrymen formed a solid wall of steel shields and long pikes. They slowly advanced, pushing the enemy to the edges of the ship. Behind them were musketeers, ready to fire a precise volley over the heads of their comrades. The use of firearms in close combat became a decisive factor. Muskets and arquebuses pierced through any light armor worn by the Ottoman defenders of the deck. After a synchronized volley, the first line of pikemen made a dash forward. This allowed them to capture significant areas of space before the enemy had time to regroup. Infantry company commanders paid special attention to controlling the high ground on the ship. The stern superstructure and main deck mast were captured first. From these positions, the riflemen could completely control all movement on the ship. Holding key points made further resistance pointless. Discipline allowed Spanish soldiers not to panic in the chaos of hand-to-hand combat. When a commander was lost, the formation did not fall apart but continued to carry out the task at hand. The soldiers moved in sync, covering each other with shields from objects flying from above. This monolithic unity became an impenetrable wall for the lightly armed enemy troops. An important part of the boarding team were sappers with axes and sturdy crowbars. Their task was to destroy barriers and doors leading to the interior of the galley. They quickly cleared the way for the main assault group of infantrymen. They also cut ropes if it became necessary to quickly separate from a sinking ship. Ottoman tactics relied on the individual skill of each warrior. The janissaries were masters of sabers and short composite bows. However, This was of little use in the cramped ship corridors and on the decks littered with debris. The teamwork and discipline of the Spaniards always proved more effective. The Venetian infantry also demonstrated a high level of training in defense. They used heavy boarding sabers and special protective gauntlets. The Venetians were well acquainted with the architecture of galleys, which helped them orient themselves faster than their opponents. The joint efforts of the Allied forces left no chance for the Ottoman boarding teams. The capture of the deck was considered successful only after complete control of the ship's helm. The infantry methodically checked all the holds and below-deck compartments. After hoisting their flag on the mast, the ship came under the control of the Holy League. Such coordinated work made it possible to capture dozens of serviceable Ottoman galleys. The Battle of Lepanto ended in a decisive tactical victory for the Holy League fleet. The Ottoman Empire lost more than 200 of its ships of the line. Dozens of serviceable galleys were captured and towed to Christian ports. This was the first large-scale defeat of the Ottoman naval forces in several decades. The destruction of the fleet dealt a serious blow to the infrastructure of the Ottoman naval bases. Along with the ships, the empire lost thousands of experienced navigators, archers, and officers. It took many years of training to restore the quality of the personnel. Building new wooden hulls took much less time than training crews. Venetian galleasses proved to be highly effective in line battles. The idea of placing heavy side artillery on rowing vessels proved to be entirely justified. These floating fortresses became a symbol of the technical superiority of European engineering. Their use forever changed the tactics of warfare at sea. The era of light, maneuverable galleys gradually began to decline. The battle showed that the outcome of a clash was decided by the mass of broadside artillery fire. Maritime powers began to actively invest in the construction of heavy sailing ships. Firepower became more valued than speed and maneuverability with oars. Despite its tremendous tactical success, the Holy League was unable to develop a strategic offensive. Disagreements between the Allies prevented them from attacking Ottoman territories on land. Venice was soon forced to conclude a separate peace with the empire. The Allied fleet broke up into separate national squadrons. The Ottoman Empire demonstrated an amazing ability to rebuild its resources. In just 1 year, a new fleet of galleys was built in the shipyards of Istanbul. However, these ships were manned by less experienced crews. The empire retained its influence, but the myth of its absolute invincibility at sea was shattered. Lepanto was the last major battle between rowing fleets in European history. The technical revolution in shipbuilding paved the way for the dominance of huge sailing ships of the line. Galleasses also gradually fell out of use due to their sluggishness. They were replaced by multi-deck galleons equipped with hundreds of cannons. The history of this battle was carefully studied in all naval academies in the following centuries. Commanders analyzed the importance of maintaining disciplined formation and the timely use of reserves. Engineers studied the impact of heavy artillery on wooden ship structures. This experience became the foundation for the development of naval tactics. Documents, drawings, and reports from participants in the battle are still kept in European archives. They allow us to reconstruct in detail the events of that autumn day in 1571. The battle became a symbol of how innovative technical approaches can change the course of history. 6 unconventional ships were able to disrupt the plans of a Visead empire. The innovations of the Venetian arsenal demonstrated the importance of secrecy in the development of new technologies. The surprise use of unknown weapons gave the Christian fleet a decisive initial advantage. The Gulf of Patras will forever remain the place where 2 different concepts of shipbuilding collided. The outcome of this collision determined the direction of the fleet's development for centuries to come. We saw how the bold engineering solutions of Venetian masters influenced the course of world history. The appearance of heavy galleasses with their devastating broadside fire leveled the enemy's numerical superiority. This battle demonstrated that competent tactics and technical innovations can break even the most confident enemy. The strict discipline of the infantry and the firepower of the cannons proved to be more effective than speed and traditional boarding methods. What historical topics would you like to see in the next videos? Suggest your ideas in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on new investigations into the mysteries of the past.